Battle of Midway. The calm before the storm. Imagine the tension in the air. The year is 1942, and the world is still reeling from the shock of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It's been 6 months since that fateful day, and now, both sides are preparing for what will become one of the most important naval battles in history, the Battle of Midway. The Japanese, under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, have planned this attack as a follow-up to their surprise strike on Pearl Harbor. They aim to knock out the last remaining U.S. military presence in the Pacific, Midway Atoll. But the Americans have a secret weapon: intelligence. The U.S. Navy's cryptographers, working tirelessly to decode Japanese messages, had intercepted critical communications indicating that Japan was planning to attack Midway. This gave the U.S. Navy a chance to set a trap. As one cryptographer, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockefeller, later recalled, "We knew what they were planning before they did it." The trap was set, and it was time for the U.S. Navy to spring into action. The battle begins. It's early morning on June 4th, 1942, and the Japanese have launched their first attack on Midway. The island is bombed heavily, but the real story is unfolding in the air above the Pacific Ocean. American pilots, flying from 3 U.S. aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, are gearing up for the fight of their lives. For many of these men, this was their first taste of real combat. Lieutenant Commander Clarence W. Bill McCluskey, a veteran of the earlier attack on the Japanese carrier Akagi, recalls the moment when he led a squadron of bombers to attack the Japanese fleet. "We saw them. They were all together, just sitting ducks. I think I knew it was going to be a pivotal moment for us, but I had no idea how much it would change everything." One of McCluskey's pilots, Lieutenant Dick Best, would later become a key figure in the battle. His squadron was tasked with attacking the Japanese carriers, and his skillful bombing run would go down in history as one of the most decisive moments of the battle. As Best later recalled, "It was all so chaotic. The Japanese fighters were swarming around us. We dove at the carrier, and I could see the explosion. The carrier was hit. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the turning point. The American ambush." As the battle raged on, the Japanese believed they had the upper hand. Their first wave of bombers had caused significant damage to Midway, and they were confident that the island's defenses would be neutralized soon. But the Japanese had underestimated one key element: the American carriers. The Japanese were so focused on attacking Midway that they didn't realize the U.S. carriers had moved into position and were now launching their counteroffensive. The element of surprise, thanks to cryptography, allowed the Americans to strike when the Japanese were least expecting it. Lieutenant Best's dive bomber squadron, along with other American bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown, descended upon the Japanese carriers. The Japanese were caught off guard. Best's squadron was the first to hit the Akagi, Japan's flagship, and the explosion was massive. As Best later recalled, "I saw it. The explosion was so big I could feel it in my stomach. I knew we had done something big. We had crippled their fleet." But the Akagi was not the only target. As the American bombers rained down on the Japanese fleet, other American pilots took out Kaga and Soryu, 2 more of Japan's most powerful carriers. By the end of the day, 3 Japanese carriers had been sunk. The Japanese struggle. For the Japanese, the loss of these carriers was devastating. Lieutenant Fuzada Ida, a Japanese officer aboard the Kaga, later described the chaos. "We couldn't understand what was happening. It was like a nightmare. Our aircraft were on fire, and the ship was sinking. We had no way to stop it. We had failed." Another Japanese officer, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, who was aboard the Soryu when it was struck, recalled the moment the ship was hit. "I was on the bridge when the first bomb hit. The explosion was so violent. We knew we couldn't save the ship. I had to give the order to abandon it." The feeling of failure was overwhelming. Even though Hiryu, Japan's last remaining carrier, fought back with a series of counterattacks, it too was eventually struck and sunk by U.S. bombers. The battle was effectively over. The final moments and aftermath. As the smoke cleared and the battle subsided, the scale of the American victory became clear. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, along with hundreds of aircraft and thousands of Japanese sailors. The Japanese Navy had suffered a blow from which it would never recover. On the American side, only the Yorktown was lost along with a few planes. The victory at Midway was a turning point in the Pacific War. One of the most poignant moments came when Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the U.S. fleet at Midway, addressed the survivors after the battle. This is a victory for all of us. But we should not forget the sacrifice of those who gave their lives. We have turned the tide, but the war is far from over. For the survivors, the aftermath of the battle was bittersweet. Many of the pilots who survived, like Lieutenant Best and Lieutenant McCluskey, were celebrated as heroes, but they always remembered the lives lost in the battle. Best, in particular, would later say, "I never liked being called a hero. There were too many good men who didn't come home." This victory wasn't just mine. It was every man who flew that day. A lasting legacy. The Battle of Midway became a turning point in the Pacific War, not just because of the strategic victory, but because of the personal sacrifices made by the men who fought there. Ensign George Gay, the only survivor from his squadron, was later remembered for his courage and resilience. He had been shot down during the battle and witnessed the destruction of the Japanese carriers firsthand. Gay, reflecting on the aftermath of the battle, said, "I was just lucky to survive. But for every one of us who came back, there were men who didn't. They will never be forgotten." The victory at Midway gave the U.S. Navy the upper hand in the Pacific and set the stage for the Allied island-hopping campaign, which would eventually lead to Japan's defeat. For those who survived the battle, like McCluskey, Best, and Gay, Midway would be a defining moment in their lives. For the men who lost their lives, Midway became a symbol of the bravery and sacrifice that shaped the course of history. The Battle of Midway wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a story of resilience, intelligence, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. And the voices of those who fought in it, whether they lived or died, echo through history as a reminder of what was at stake. This content has been adapted for the powerful features of Polyspeaks for You, South Africa's leading accessibility software. Learn more at www.polyspeaksforyou.co.za. We invite you to support this meaningful dyslexic initiative crafted and developed by an individual who personally understands the challenges of dyslexia.